Welcome to the Onyx Report, a program that critically analyzes the experiences, histories, and perceptions of black males in American society across age, class, region, sexuality, and profession. I'm your host, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Fresno State, Black Male Studies Scholar, and Black Male Advocate. In the program, we examine current events and major issues using an empirically driven Black Masculinist theoretical lens, thus including such concepts as the black male dual economy, anti-black misandry, phallicism, the subordinate male target hypothesis, and the black gynarchy. Our goal is to remind people, including black men themselves, of black men's humanity. Join us every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific, either on YouTube or innerlightradio.com. All right. Welcome back to the Onyx Report. Hope everybody is as well as possible on this 1st of July. As the virus apparently has kicked back into effect, states are beginning to roll back, including California, and I hope that you all are as safe and as healthy as possible. I want to first shout out my boy Sarah, whose shows are on Tuesday nights. He was on last night. Wanted to extend him, a blessed solar return today. So I wish him well, and I hope he is indeed at the beach with his feet kicked up or meditating, one of the two at the moment, But, as we do at the Onyx Report, we deal with black men and news that is pertinent to them. And today I have a guest whose research and work definitely speak directly to that, but most particularly in regard to black male athletes. So we'll be getting to that in a moment. And where I like to start is, to actually get some of these current events in place before we kind of bring in our guest. This one is a little different. This is not necessarily a news report, and in fact, it's based on an episode that is quite a few, I think at least over 5 years old at this point. It's an episode of TV One's Unsung, and it's the episode dealing with Ike and Tina Turner. It's been kind of hard to find lately, but I believe you can find a copy of it on YouTube. And I would urge you to check it out because it deals with some aspects of Ike's life that you won't find in the What's Love Got to Do With It film, right? In particular, it talks about his father being lynched, and although surviving the lynching for a period of time, it was said that his intestines were literally beaten outside of his body. And because the local hospitals would not treat black people, they literally had to create a tent for him in the backyard of the house where his family kind of treated him for a while. But it was said that his intestines could be smelled for miles. And after he eventually passed away from the ages of 6 to 12, Ike was then raped by several grown women. So as you know, the Onyx Report takes a Black Masculinist approach to analyzing phenomena. And when we look at the lives of Ike and Tina Turner, what we see, as is the case with many black men, we're dehumanized, we're made into these walking monsters, and we're not really often given context. And I don't mean that to excuse any black man's behavior, but I find when it comes to other groups, we can humanize them and understand why they've done different things. But when it comes to black men, we seem to be quite comfortable with leaving them at the status of boogeymen. But if you can actually look at the life that Ike led and the time period they lived in, an episode like this might help us understand him a bit more than the theatrical film's performance. All right. Next up, I would urge people to check out an article it's on a website entitled InTheseTimes.com. The title of the article is "In the U.S., Where Lynchings Were Prevalent, Police Are More Likely to Shoot Black People." So, in U.S. counties where lynchings were more prevalent, police are more likely to shoot black people. Subtitle is "Areas with Higher Numbers of Lynchings from 1877 to 1950 Have More Officer-Involved Shootings of Black Americans Today." So the argument that history plays into our current experiences is often dismissed by people who like to say history has nothing to do with the present. That was ancient history. That was a long time ago. But we find that many of these attitudes and perspectives are, passed down intergenerationally, right? And so we can see how the environment, the policies in place, the treatment, the culture, and the specific attitudes that are no doubt passed on through family might play a serious role in the treatment of African American people, most particularly in those areas in the South where lynchings were in high practice. Next up, article on news.yahoo.com. 2 teenage boys shot to death after asking man how tall he was while buying candy. This is an article dated on June 28th, 2020, and marks out an occurrence that took place Saturday, June 20th at 5 p.m. After 3 teenage boys went to a store in South Chicago to buy candy and ended up having a brief encounter with a 19-year-old Leroy Battle inside the establishment. And from there, the victims were walking in the store. They saw Battle standing in line while at the store, and the victims commented that he was tall. They asked him how tall he was and hoped that they'd be tall someday. And Deputy Chief and Detectives Brendan Dennehy unfortunately said, unfortunately, we will never even see the full growth of these poor children. 3 boys then left the store, proceeded to walk home together when police say Battle approached them and began shooting. So unclear as to what's entirely happened here, but definitely go check the article. And I haven't checked for updates, so you can see if there's been any developments since then as far as clarification is concerned. Next up, check an article on NewYorkTimes.com. This article is dated June 25th, 2020, written by David Leonhardt, and the title is "The Black-White Wage Gap is as Big as It Was in 1950." Now, this is particularly interesting because, as we found out very recently, 1 out of 2 black people have lost their employment since February, and we know that when it came to black men in over 30 major cities, black men's unemployment rate was already between 40 and 50%. So when you factor in the historical narrative, what we're finding is that black men are still, black men in particular are still there in regard to where we were in the 1950s in relation to white men. So in terms of the chart on black male earnings, for every dollar earned by white men, black men find themselves between 57 and 67 cents, depending on the time period, and that seems to be the latest part of the chart. But you can go more in depth into it in case you're curious, so we can have a better understanding of where black men find themselves. And I believe that the chart leaves us at 51 cents on the dollar. But again, many of these studies don't incorporate incarceration. This may be one that does. So take a look at it when you get a chance. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it, but I might do a show on it in the near future just to get more depth to it. But I wanted to just alert you to it, give you a chance to check it out. Next up is an article on CBSNews.com entitled 3 Charged in Death of a Black Teen Who Died After Being Restrained at a Youth Facility. This article is written June 27, 2020, and basically frames a young African-American male, 16-year-old Cornelius Frederick, who was killed by what they call restraint asphyxia. So basically this teenager who was at a youth facility in Kalamazoo, Michigan, had been charged, or 3 staff members, I should say, at the Kalamazoo youth facility were charged with the death of this young teenager after he apparently threw a sandwich and they held him down in an unnecessarily brutal fashion and took this young man's life. The staff members, Michael Mosley, Zachary Solis, and Heather McLogan, were charged with involuntary manslaughter and second-degree child abuse. According to the charging documents, Mosley and Solis are accused of restraining Frederick in a grossly negligent manner. McLogan, who was a nurse at the facility, is accused of failing to seek timely medical care for the teen. Right? Now, this goes back in a strange kind of way to what I just talked about with Ike Turner, in that once black males are conveniently categorized as nothing more than monsters whose humanity doesn't need to be reflected upon, it's easy to see how people can actually engage in these kind of acts and not think anything of it. Because it's easy to do that when you have someone that you don't necessarily regard as human. So I would urge you to check this article out and stay current on these kind of things, so we can kind of keep track, because these stories pop up and disappear, especially when it comes to black males. So yeah, you might get 1 or 2 that get some international attention, especially these days, since we have such a fetishistic relationship with black male death. They may become popular if there's video of them being killed, but if not, they tend to fall to the wayside. So again, when it comes to police abuse, police homicide, we're talking about 200 to 300 black men a year. I would say, we know about 2 or 3 on a wide scale at best. Usually it's between 1 or 2. And again, as if they're caught on video dying. But for the rest of them, we often don't know. And that doesn't even include those killed by vigilantes. So keep in mind those numbers are actually quite low. Okay. Another one up. This is dated, this looks like May 2020. This is on Axios.com, entitled "Almost Half of the U.S. Population Does Not Have a Job." So we are currently seeing some unprecedented kind of issues, and I know I don't have to tell you that. Many of you are living with it as we speak, but the article states the percentage of Americans who are employed sits at just over 50%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The figure plunged to 51.3 in April, lowest level on record, and edged up to 52.8% in May. Right, so we're probably at about the mid 40s in terms of. I know we're over 42 million who have filed for unemployment, but that doesn't include people who are not technically unemployed. They're not working hours at their jobs, but they haven't technically been fired. And find themselves in a kind of holding position, so that's the kind of situation we're finding ourselves in, and hopefully we'll be able to see some changes soon, because I know people are definitely struggling. But the issue is, as the old saying goes, when white folks catch a cold, black folk catch pneumonia. So when we talk about unemployment, when we talk about poverty, when we talk about homelessness, incarceration, you name it, it tends to be more extreme, even if the news doesn't capture that. So please be mindful of that, especially when engaging one another. Let's try and be as supportive as possible, because so many of us are going through so many different things that it's quite ridiculous at this point. Last one up, article on Forbes.com, and this one is dated, I hate when they don't put the immediate dates in. Here we go, June 23rd, 2020. This is entitled "Doctors Issuing Unlawful Do Not Resuscitate Orders for Disabled COVID Patients." Look at that one on Forbes.com, and it's showing you how disabled victims of the COVID virus are given DNRs without consent in many instances. And there was a recent article that I published I posted on my Facebook page of an African American disabled man who apparently had not been fed for 6 days and was left to literally starve to death. He was suffering from COVID, was taken to the hospital, and at that point they decided that it wasn't worth feeding him, because it was said that his quality of life was already low because of his disability, and literally starved to death. So these are the kinds of conditions that black men in particular are finding themselves in amidst this pandemic. It's reflective of the experiences many black men have already been having, regardless of context. But again, as the situation gets extreme for everybody, it tends to get even more extreme for those at the bottom. So keep that in mind. Now, today we have a treat. We have a scholar coming in from, let me just go ahead and actually just read what I've actually kind of written about him, because I want to make sure that he's regarded with the due respect that he has more than earned. This is Dr. Joseph N. Cooper. He is the author of From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, Black Male Holistic Underdevelopment Through Sport and Miseducation, and that is through Peter Lang Publications 2019. And he's here to discuss his book and his research in general. He is the Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership and Administration in the Department of Leadership and Education at University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's a professor of sports management, gender and race in sport, racism and other forms of oppression, higher education, and qualitative research. He's the recipient of the 2019 UConn National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Youth and College Chapter Faculty Lifetime Achievement Award. And he's accomplished this at a relatively young age, but I definitely want to shout out how incredible his CV is. So let's welcome Dr. Joseph N. Cooper to the Onyx Report. How you doing, sir?
Hey, good evening, Dr. Johnson. Great to be with you this evening.
Oh man, glad you could be here. Glad you could be here. As you know, I like to start by kind of talking about where people have come from and how they, you know, kind of grew up, because I think it's important, especially for younger Black males, to kind of see the widespread possibilities of where, you know, many people are coming from and what they've been able to accomplish. So if you wouldn't mind, tell us, where are you from and where were you raised?
No, great. Thank you for asking. And I always think it's important to understand our past. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor who used the cliche, research is me search. Okay. And if we apply an African or Afrocentric lens to that cliche, we would say research is we search. Okay. And so knowing from whence we came helps explain who we are today and where we're going. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. So very famous city. My parents, my father, Armand Jamale Cooper, and my mother, Jewel Egerton Cooper. Shortly after I was born, I'm the youngest of two. I have an older brother, Adam Cooper. We relocated to Greensboro, North Carolina. My mother is originally from Raleigh, North Carolina. And for many of you who remember the civil rights movement, Greensboro was, arguably considered the birthplace of the sit-in movement. There were 4 Black students, David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, Ezell Blair Jr., who sat at the Woolworths counter. At the time, it was white only. And they courageously sat and initiated a sit-in movement that was obviously also connected to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and really challenging racial injustice in the city of Greensboro. So that's my hometown. I'm very proud of it. I grew up there. My mother is a professor or associate dean at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. But she previously taught at Bennett College, which is one of the historically Black women's colleges in the United States. So my early socialization, not only from a academic educational standpoint, but from a sociocultural standpoint, was at Bennett College and at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, which as of today, it's the largest HBCU in terms of student enrollment in the United States. My father was a psychiatrist, had a medical background, and in North Carolina, sports are very, very popular. I always tell people, particularly the sport of basketball, is akin to a religion in North Carolina. So when you talk about how the socialization impacts young Black males growing up in that context, it's extremely powerful. I mean, I was watching, they were covering Vince Carter the other day, and I was thinking, even though he's from Florida originally, he played basketball at North Carolina. And I was thinking to myself, man, the greatest dunker in NBA history played basketball at North Carolina, and the greatest basketball player, arguably the greatest basketball player, Michael Jordan, grew up in North Carolina and played there. So, and even today, if you look at the NBA, 3 of the top 10 point guards are all from North Carolina: Steph Curry, Chris Paul, and John Wall. And so when you talk about how sports were integrated into my childhood, although I grew up being exposed to Black professionals in a range of areas, sport was definitely a big part of my identity development. And as we'll get into talking to when I talk a little bit later in the interview about the research, ultimately, I had to identify my holistic self beyond sport once my athletic career concluded. But that's just a little bit about my background.
Well, no, actually, that's where I was going to go next. I was going to ask if you played, because, I mean, clearly, you know, in your family, education is huge. You know, the focus on, a professional standing in both the university, but in terms of, in larger society. It sounds like your father, did he practice? I mean, did he have a practice, or was he teaching psychology?
No, he had his own practice. He was a psychiatrist. And in both my father and my mother's family, education was heavily emphasized. My father grew up even though he was born in Nashville, Tennessee, he grew up in Monrovia, Liberia. So there's obviously quite a bit of African American historical context in the country of Liberia and the history of Liberia and the dynamics there. So that was a part of his lived experience in Liberia, as well as across the continent of Africa. Soccer is the most popular sport, football, which is what is known globally. Right. So he was much more familiar with that sport, which I played from my youth days all the way up till freshman year in high school. I played soccer. Okay. But my mother, she was not an athlete, but what she always taught me was that sport was a vehicle to help develop myself beyond just wins and losses. Mm-hmm. So she was always cultivating that critical consciousness in me when I was participating in sports. Getting me to ask questions about, who's operating this event, this tournament. How many Black players are on your team? Who are the coaches? Right. And different things of that nature, which at an early age, I'm beginning to understand the systems in which we're existing in. And another thing, my mother grew up in Raleigh during the heart of the civil rights movement. So, her and her classmates and her siblings were among those of the cohorts that were first assimilating into schools. I know we oftentimes use the term integration, but my colleagues and I, Dr. Japhas Kenyatta Cavill, he's a professor at Texas Southern University, a preeminent scholar on HBCU athletics. And then my other colleague, Dr. Jeremy Cheeks, he's a professor at Alabama A&M University. And we talk about, Dr. Cavill had an engineering background, and he says, look, in engineering, integration means that there's a transference of energy going both ways. What took place post Brown v. Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement was really assimilation. And so my mother, growing up in North Carolina, which is obviously a former Confederate state, deeply rooted in racism, anti-Black racism specifically, really instilled in me having that critical consciousness in sport. So when I was growing up, basketball and soccer were my favorite sports. I really wasn't big into football. It became more popular in North Carolina over the years, but a lot of people don't remember the Carolina Panthers, the NFL team. They're a relatively young franchise compared to many of the other NFL teams across the country. And football in the state of North Carolina really is not as popular as states like Florida and Georgia and Texas. So basketball was really the primary sport. And when you think about kind of establishing your boyhood into manhood, if you're skilled in basketball, you get a different type of reverence and a different type of identity affirmation than if you do well in any other sport.
Okay. So let's back up a little bit. So you played through college or through high school?
I played all the way through high school. My freshman year, I attended, similar to a lot of young Black males growing up in North Carolina, I wanted to be like Michael Jordan. So I attended North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I wasn't recruited to play basketball there. When I was in high school, I had recruiting attention, no full scholarship offers from schools like University of Nebraska, East Carolina University, Furman University. So a lot of mid-major Division I schools, but I didn't get any full scholarship offers, even though, I was pretty accomplished in our area in North Carolina and in the region. So my goal was, when I go to North Carolina, I'm going to make the JV team because they had a junior varsity team, and then I'd get moved up to varsity. So my freshman year, I made the JV team. This is back in 2002, fall 2002. And during that time, early on, after making the team, it became clear to me that, not only is it going to be a lot of work, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get a scholarship. And if you do get moved up to varsity, you're not going to get an extensive amount of play time, especially at my size. I'm 5'9". Back then, my playing weight was about 185. So the star point guard on the team there at the time was Raymond Felton. who's still in the NBA now. In high school, 2 out of my 4 years of high school, Chris Paul's team knocked us out of the playoffs. So I've always competed against the highest level of competition. And so at freshman year, once I realized that even as skilled as I was, I just wasn't quite good enough to make varsity. And even if I made it, I knew that I wasn't going to play a lot. And the competitor in me, I wouldn't want to be on the team if I couldn't play. I've always been, if I'm going to be on the team, I want to work hard enough to be able to play. So I stepped away from the game my freshman year after making the team. It was a very tough decision. And that actually is what led into what a lot of former athletes experience is what I call a post-athletic career identity crisis. And it has a particular acute impact on Black males because of some of the broader socio-ecological circumstances and conditions that we face in society. Dr. Harry Edwards, which many of you are familiar with, who spearheaded the Olympic Project for Human Rights in the 1960s and was a very outspoken activist in using sport as a tool for social change. He called it the post-athletic career disengagement trauma. And so he was one of the first ones to really categorize when your athletic career concludes that it can be a form of trauma. Right. So that after I stopped playing basketball during my freshman year, stopped playing competitively, I really was at a loss for who I was as a Black male when I was 17, just turning 18 years old. And, that led me down a journey to really refine myself. And that's a part of why the book is titled From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, because I feel like for us as African people and as Black people, we were created from greatness and we come from greatness. But oftentimes, depending on where we grow up, where we're born, we are exposed to circumstances that are unfavorable to cultivating our greatness. So in the context of sport, many of us experience various forms of exploitation, commodification, dehumanization, and what is popular in the literature called athletic identity foreclosure. And I definitely experienced all of those and did not realize it until after my career concluded and I had more time to analyze what took place with me and why it impacted my psyche and my existence so much.
Well, and that's incredibly important to look at too, because so much of our status, so much of our social currency comes in going into entertainment and being recognized only in specific spheres. So, when you talk about the kind of trauma that can come about from having to formally acknowledge that your athletic career is over and you need to redefine yourself in a new way, that I can understand how that'd be difficult to do if athleticism was a possibility, because obviously for the overwhelming majority of people, it's not even a possibility. But if it's a possibility and you're out playing and you're navigating through college offers and so on and so forth, there's a great deal of pressure, it would seem, placed on you at that point to succeed in those ways. So when you had to go through that transition of saying, okay, my athletic career is over, let me redefine myself, it sounds like the academic route. It sounds like the legacy that your mother is still. It sounds like she's still blazing. Did that directly come into play, or was your decision to go into academics purely kind of something that came out of a whole different context? What was that transition that said let me go into academia, let me go into research? How did that come about?
No, that's a great question. To get to your former point, I really want the audience to know, for a lot of young Black males, historically, if we look back in the antebellum period, there were select Black males who were extracted from the plantation to participate in sports like boxing, horse racing, and because of their athletic ability, they received favorable treatment. So sports from a historical context within the United States. Now, in African cultures, physical activity and sport was always connected to communalism, spirituality, even in some cases training young men in preparation for battle against outside entities or other entities. But within the context of the United States, sports largely was limited to European whites or European white Americans. So when blacks were granted access to it, it was actually viewed as almost a badge of humanity. So I think that's an important point for us to understand socioculturally and historically, that black people's attraction to sport is not just for the glitz and glamour and the fame, which is a part of the disillusion, but it's also a deeper desire to be treated as a human being. When you think about it, if you go to any city across the country, and you'll see a lot of even small towns, if they have a famous black athlete or a famous athlete, they'll name a road after them. They may have a holiday if they've won a Super Bowl. So their elevated status, when you compare that to the normalized oppression that black males experience, it's almost as if I'm only human when I wear the uniform. Right. And so therefore, when the career ends, I'm no longer human anymore. Right. That is a much bigger or a much more drastic form of trauma than we often discuss. It's because it's when a lot of basketball players will say, like, sport is my sanctuary or sport is my place of peace. And I always say, and I write in the book, that statement says more about their world outside of sport than it does the sport itself. Right. Because if sport is your sanctuary, then that would mean that everything else is essentially, a very bad place for you. Right. I mean, you can use all kinds of descriptions to describe it. So I think that the humanity piece, and we have to ask ourselves as a society, why do we treat black males who are talented in sports so much better than we do black males who are not involved in sport, or even former black male athletes? Because you can imagine, or black males who are former athletes, if you were known for your athletic ability, that's an intoxicating feeling. People want to be close to you. People admire you. People see you. Right. And then when you're no longer that anymore, it's almost akin to having a certain type of spotlight, and even from you feel like you're affirmed in a way that you can't get that from any other type of behavior. And so that's a big part of it. But in terms of how I got into academia,
and just real quick, it doesn't sound like there's any preparation for that transition.
Oh, no. I mean, you really, here's where I'll give a shout out to other black men and our black women. Oftentimes we'll have family members, friends, and people in our lives, as you mentioned, who weren't as heavily invested in sport. And this is where that support system comes in so much, because for a lot of black males, either it be through their intimate relationships or through social circles, if they join other organizations, they really begin to rediscover who they really are and who their interests are besides sport. Because if you're really competitive in sport, it's going to take up a large amount of your time. Right. Like if you're really trying to be skilled at something, Malcolm Gladwell says in his book, the 10,000 hour rule, that definitely applies to sport. If you're really serious about it, you're going to put in a lot of time. Well, if you're spending time focusing on your craft in sport, then that's time that's not being spent somewhere else. And so that notion of how do you transition effectively out of it, in the book, I call it identity transition empowerment. And so how do we acknowledge the significant investment psychologically, physically, spiritually, emotionally that young people have towards the sport, but also help them effectively transition out of being an athlete? Right. Because it's this idea that you were always a holistic person. You were never just an athlete. If you bought into the lie that you were only an athlete, that is about as dehumanizing as other stereotypes that plague our people. So you always have to frame it to the former athlete as you're always more than just an athlete. That's why I commend LeBron James on his More Than an Athlete platform, because just in using that language, he's shifting the paradigm in terms of how young athletes view themselves.
And it's absolutely necessary, because in the last 20 years, so many of my students have been athletes, and I've watched a startling number of them go from being a college athlete to going right back home where they came from. And it could have been something as simple as tripping down the stairs and injuring themselves, but their entire athletic career is over. All the hopes that they had and the people that raised them, supported them, so on and so forth, the neighborhood, all of that is gone. And they're starting from scratch, and in some instances, sleeping on the couch at their mother's house. So that transition of going from I'm going to be a pro and support my family and have all of these accolades to people barely know your name, and how am I gonna go in from here? But I want you to tell us how you transitioned into academia. But if you could, I'd also like for you to tell us a little bit about what you've noticed in your research as far as the academic preparation of athletes from K through 12 to college. So if you could kind of give us both, and I know we're jumping around here, but I want to get both perspectives from you while I have you.
No worries. Yeah, they're both very relevant and very interconnected. In terms of how I got into what I do now, as I mentioned, after freshman year, I had an identity crisis. I was a business major my freshman year at Carolina. And, in my mind, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I associated entrepreneurship with manhood, right? This idea that you own your own business. You don't have to work for the quote unquote the man. Right. So that was an aspiration of mine. And growing up, I was enamored with barbershops. Everything from getting a fresh fade, a shape up, and just the communalism among black men in the barbershop was a very powerful and endearing space to me. And I've always wanted to own a barbershop. Not necessarily did I want to be a barber, but I wanted to own a facility that cultivated that type of experience for young black men and young black boys. So I was a business major at Carolina, but I took business calculus and macro and microeconomics. And back then, the classes the economics classes, it's like 300 people in a class. You have 3 exams that are like 70% of the grade. Even though I went to a high school that academically prepared me for Carolina, some of those courses were extremely challenging. The business calculus course was extremely challenging. So I did not do well in those courses. And so the option at that point is either you can retake them to improve your grade because at Carolina at the time, you couldn't get into the business school unless you had a minimum of a 3.0 GPA. And actually, they placed a premium on those who had a 3.5 or higher. So once you didn't do well in those gateway courses, which happens to a lot of black students, whether it be at historically white institutions or HBCUs, more often at historically white institutions, you're kind of in a place of, my whole life I wanted to be a doctor, I wanted to be an engineer, I wanted to do this, but I didn't do well in these gateway courses. What do I do now? So I ended up switching my major 5 times. I ended up double majoring in sociology and recreation administration. They didn't have a sport major in undergrad at the time. They had an exercise science major, but that was more around being an athletic trainer, an exercise physiologist, which I wasn't interested in. I was more interested into being an administrator. So at that time, when I graduated, my goals were either to be an athletic director at a high school or at a college, because I said, hey, now that I'm no longer an athlete, I want to be involved in making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to other young black athletes to where they feel lost after their career ends. Right. And I started working at a YMCA after I graduated. And I had not only my mother and my father, mainly my mother and other mentors in my life who were saying, hey, have you thought about graduate school? And at the time I didn't, because I bought into the whole notion that, once you graduate college, you got a bachelor's, life is supposed to be great after that. Just magically, everything's supposed to be taken care of. And I just didn't know what I wanted to do. I had friends who wanted to law school. I didn't want to do that. I had friends who got involved in politics and education. And I was like, that's not quite me. So I ended up applying to graduate school to a sport administration master's program. And this is where it really connects to why I got into the academic route. That graduate program required us to do a master's thesis. Most sport-based master's programs train you to be a practitioner in the sport industry. So whether you want to be a sport agent, athletic director, general manager, those are what most sport master's programs do. But this program had a research focus, and that was at North Carolina as well. And I did my master's thesis on critical success factors for Black male football student athletes at a predominantly white institution. Okay. And doing that research, I began to identify some themes that mapped on to what I experienced. You know, this idea of social isolation, aside from athletics, academic neglect, in terms of the same attention that's applied to young Black boys in sports is not always applied for academics. And that ties into your second question. And when we look at what are the environment, the contextual factors that would explain Black male engagement and success in sports compared to other educational spaces like the classroom, because I do consider sports an educational space. Okay. I think there's a myth that athletics and academics are totally separate. I think there's such a thing called kinesthetic intelligence. If you ask any young Black boy who plays football to describe the routes that they have to run and the different defensive schemes, I would argue that's as sophisticated as any calculus formula, as any chemistry, physics formula. Like, it's very complex concepts that young men and women are able to break down and identify, not only from a cognitive standpoint, but then physically they actually perform the action. So,
but you know what's interesting about that is you don't appreciate it in many instances until you actually try it.
Absolutely.
You know, as long as you're sitting there watching it on TV, you can get used to that. We become desensitized to it, especially if you're used to just watching high level, you know, professional athletes performing at the top level. You really just take it for granted. But let somebody get you out there and you have to try to run a pattern.
Absolutely.
And then you start to appreciate that kinesthetic intelligence.
Absolutely.
But go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a form of brilliance that we don't talk about often enough. It's similar to music and art. When you see artists performing their craft at a high level, it's something that's beautiful to watch. And we oftentimes, because we have that mind-body duality mindset, which didn't come from African people, then we begin to look at the body as an object that is separate from the mind. And it actually, for the body to function, it requires the mind to be operating at a high frequency and a high level. But after doing my master's thesis, I was able to meet some other Black faculty members. Dr. Deborah Stroman, who's still at the University of North Carolina, introduced me to some other Black faculty members who were in doing research in sports. Some of them were in African American Studies or Africana Studies or sociology. Some of them were in more sports specific disciplines. But when I met those individuals, they really challenged me. Some of them in ways that I was, more accepting to at the time. Others that were not as I wasn't as accepting to at the time. But nonetheless, the competitive drive that I applied to sports, once they challenged me in an academic sense, that's all I needed. Some of you have watched the Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls documentary, The Last Dance, over the past couple of... Remember how he would talk about, like, just the slightest thing would just trigger him to go very hard? Like Clyde Drexler in the 92 finals said, he was... Or somebody said Clyde Drexler was better than him, and he was just like, no, that's not going to happen.
Poor Clyde.
So he torched him, right? Yeah, hit like 7 3-pointers in the first half. So,
and that was sad because Clyde didn't have nothing to do with it.
No, Clyde wasn't even involved in that, man. And Clyde is a great player. So, but needless to say, that fire got ignited in me, and from that, I ended up going down to the University of Georgia. I'm working with Dr. Billy Hawkins. He's the author of a book called The New Plantation, Black Athletes, College Sports, and Predominantly White Institutions. And that really just fueled me to say, let me pursue a career in academia. Even though I wanted to be an athletic director, being a Black professor, I can engage in multiple levels of transformative change. I can do research that looks at the intersection of race, gender, sport, culture, activism. And I can also be in the classroom and teach courses to not only other Black students so that they could see you can be connected to sport beyond being an athlete and still pursue a successful career, but also to white students who are going to go work in the industry to help challenge them on the stereotypes and biases that they possess that oftentimes are anti-Black. I can't tell you how many of my students will say, well, yeah, Black people are just naturally gifted in football and basketball. And then once I break down the research to them and I help them understand that race is a social construct, and when you look at all of the different the different genes that we all possess, and even if you look at sport participations internationally, that just doesn't hold up, that race in and of itself would explain performance in sport. And so they begin to understand how those ideas that they were socialized into believing were actually racist in nature. But as it pertains to the second part, just briefly, that I'll answer about Black males and academics, a lot of the statistics that we read about Black male underperformance in the K through 12 schooling process, within those statistics, they include Black males who are involved in athletics. So if you look at percentages to say, one of the Shots Foundation reports said that the graduation rate for Black males was 59%. That was just one that they did. And I believe that was back in 2015 that they published that one. Well, it's not only about graduating high school that can be a challenge, but it's about having academic readiness for college. And the institution in which you go to makes a major difference. There's some institutions that are more supportive in helping students with academic needs. And then there are other institutions, like many of the high-profile sport institutions, that totally neglect Black male academic needs, right? Because the idea is that you got here because of your body and your sport. We're going to keep you eligible. We're not going to really educate you, because education would involve a level of critical consciousness about the system in which they're operating. And these institutions, which are an extension of our neoliberal, capitalist, white society, would say, we actually have a better way of utilizing these bodies when they're not properly educated, right? So it goes back to Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, is that the system isn't broken, it's working exactly the way that it's designed. So if we could have, I remember when I was at UConn, the year they won the national championship, which was my first year there as an assistant professor, I think on the team it was close to 90% Black. And at the same time, the percentage of Black male students at the university was less than 4%, right? And then even among those that were on the team, the graduation rates were so low that the year before, 2014, they won the national championship. Many people don't remember. In 2013, the UConn men's basketball team was banned from the NCAA tournament because they had 4 consecutive years where they did not graduate over 50% of their players.
Wow.
So that is a powerful just illustration there that says, hey, we're going to recruit you to play ball, to make money for us, but we're not concerned about whether you earn a degree. And even if you earn a degree, we're not concerned about educating you so that you can use that knowledge to improve your communities, to improve the plight of your people. So when you ask the question about academic readiness for Black male athletes, it's the same question that is asked for Black males overall. So that's why for a lot of Black scholars on Black males, I talked to Dr. Siri McDougall the other day, great work, already ordered his book. I've talked to Dr. Tommy Curry before in the past, and I cite his work in my book. But I always tell these scholars who focus on Black males, even, Sean Harper, who's in higher education, and all these other scholars, is that, hey, don't separate Black male athletes out from the analysis of what all Black males go through. There is some nuanced complexities to what athletes experience, but the same holistic needs that Black males who aren't involved in sport need, Black males in sport need it too. And I would argue they may need it more depending on the context in which they're socialized into sport. Because for a lot of young Black males, there are white individuals who are controlling sport. And they don't have the socio-cultural connection to empower the young men to understand why sport is a means to an end, not an end in of itself. And so if you got young black boys who have white coaches who are giving them access to these high-profile AAU tournaments, football classics, giving them scholarships to these big schools, helping their families in ways that, because of systemic oppression, our communities were not always able to access certain type of finances and resources. They begin to view that whiteness as a means to humanity. Right. Gets back to the point I was making earlier. And William C. Rodin in $40 Million Slaves, he talks about that when he talks about the conveyor belt. It's this idea of let's create the illusion to these young black boys that you have to desire what white professional league owners, sport agents, all these people have, even the shoe companies. And if you follow that carrot for long enough, they'll extract everything they want out of you. And then once you're done, it's what I call in the book, it's a figurative death. They just leave you to die, and then you have to figure it out after that.
Now, hold on. Now you brought up the book, and I want to do that because we have about 9 minutes. I want to give you a chance to talk about both the book and any other relevant projects, that can kind of give us a sense of where your most current research is taking you to. So tell us a little bit about the book first.
Great. So the book is called From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, Black Male Holistic Underdevelopment Through Sport and Miseducation. And the words under and miss are put in parentheses because the main crux of the book is that as I was reading literature on black males who were involved in sport, they would always use a deficit-based theory or lens and, situate black males as innately intellectually inferior or innately athletically superior. And I knew through my lived experiences and my friends and family members that it was more complex than we just played sport and we didn't focus on anything else. So in the book, I highlight 5 different socialization models that capture a more heterogeneous group of black males' experiences in and through sport. So the first model is the illusion of singular success. The second model is the elite athlete lottery model. The third model is the transition recovery model. The fourth model is purposeful participation for expansive personal growth model. And then the last one is the holistic empowerment model. And just to say it concisely, since we don't have time to go in depth into all of the models, basically I say when black males are miseducated, they are more likely to be exploited through schooling systems and through sport. But when they're properly educated, whether it be at the end of their careers or afterwards, which is what the transition recovery model talks about, or earlier in their lives, which is what the purposeful participation model talks about, is that not all black males experience identity foreclosure. A lot of black males like Myron Rolle, like Kylan Moore, these individuals understood the value of academics and education from an early age because of their family, and it was instilled in them. And they've always used sport as a tool to a greater aim. Both of those young black men that I mentioned, they were Rhodes Scholars, and Myron Rolle is a neurosurgeon now, and Kylan Moore is finishing up his master's, and I believe he's pursuing his PhD. And then the holistic empowerment model ties into my more recent work around black males who are involved in sport who engage in activism. And so I talk about Paul Robeson, I talk about Dr. Harry Edwards, Muhammad Ali, and my forthcoming book is called A Legacy of African American Resistance and Activism Through Sport. Nice. And I go all the way back to the 1600s, all the way up to the 21st century, and analyze how black males who are African Americans, including African American females, have used sport as a space of resistance. Some of them have used sport to engage in activism, but other times they engage in what I call borderline activism, which could be advocacy, pioneering, or just using their agency to disrupt some type of status quo. So that's where my work is now, and I'm really excited about getting the book out. I present a typology of activism, which talks about media activism, legal activism, economic activism, symbolic activism, scholarly activism, grassroots activism, mass mobilization activism. And then I also present a typology of resistance because I argue that blacks' existence in oppressive societies, our existence is a form of resistance in and of itself because we're not supposed to exist at all. And if we are, we're supposed to be subservient. So whenever we do things that are non-subservient, that existence challenges the status quo. But I also argue that all of our existence isn't activism per se. So the resistance typology talks about the differences between agency, between pioneering, advocacy, hybrid resistance, activism, social movements, revolutions, and sustained cultural empowerment.
Okay. Beautiful. Now, this the next project, the next book is coming out when, would you say?
It should be out by the end of the summer. I've submitted the final version to the editors, and I did the revisions that they asked for. So hopefully it'll be out by August, but at the latest it'll be out this fall. And it'll be published through Peter Lang as well. I can make sure to send you that information once it's available. It's the same publisher that Dr. McDougall published his Black Men's Studies book with. So both of us have used Peter Lang for a publication outlet for our work. But yes, I'm very excited about it, and I really hope, and I think it's very timely when we look at a lot of the activism of current professional, college, and interscholastic and youth athletes. It's really important for us to understand the history and how we have always used sport, just like we use other aspects of society, to champion our humanity, to champion for civil rights, and to champion our collective progress.
But tell us, and real quick, by the way, you mentioned Dr. McDougall. For those who don't know, I interviewed Dr. McDougall on my YouTube channel, so you can go there and see the interview about his text. But go ahead and tell us, in the last couple minutes we have, what is your perspective on sport activism in the midst of this pandemic? What are your thoughts about where it is and how it's presented?
I think we're seeing an awakening of Black holistic athletes. We're at a time right now with the pandemic mapping on to the high profile recordings of the murders of our brothers and sisters. And it is sparked a level of action that it's almost as if you're not going against it, against the racism and against the oppression, your passiveness is a part of the problem as well. And we've always known that that's the case, but up until this point, outside of the 1960s, where you had the civil rights movement, Black Power movement taking place, where you had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Jim Brown, Wilma Rudolph, all of these individuals who were integrally connected to the broader social movement, we're seeing an awakening. LeBron James has been at the forefront, Venus and Serena Williams. It was great to see the NFL players, Michael Thomas, Deshaun Watson, Patrick Mahomes. A lot of college athletes are starting to take a stand and express, going back to the Missouri boycott back in 2015. And even before that, in 2014, you had the Northwestern football players who filed with the National Labor Relations Board so that they could be treated as employees and get workers' compensation and other employee benefits, and also the rights to form as a union so that they could challenge policies and conditions that were unfavorable to them while they were in school. So I think that we're in a pivotal time. I'm excited to see that more Black holistic athletes are using their platforms to champion social justice and racial justice. But only time will tell if this is going to be a permanent shift or if this is just a brief moment. What I will say is this: similar to sport, I think we ought to look at athletes as well as all of our community members. We all play different positions that lead to a collective goal. Sometimes what I find in our general society is that we're expecting the athletes to be the lead activists. And in a respectful way, many of them may not have the knowledge and the information to be the activists. So you're asking them to do something that they haven't necessarily been training to do. Now, many of them are, but it would almost be the equivalent of asking Odell Beckham Jr. to play quarterback, right? Like, that isn't the position that he's been training to play, right? Like, how about we maximize him as a wide receiver, and that could still be a part of our victory, right? So it's this idea of how do we leverage all of our community members, including holistic athletes, And they can use their platform. For some of them, social media activism may be the biggest thing they do. For others of them, it may be the economic activism. But the idea that we judge them whether they're protesting or not, I think is highly problematic, because I think that they can utilize their resources in a multitude of ways, such as LeBron James building the school in Akron, Ohio. We can talk about the curriculum and all the other things, but the idea that he was intentional about building a school in a community that has experienced systematic economic deprivation, and many of those students are young black males similar to him when he was growing up in Akron, we have to say that that is a positive thing. Now,
hold on, Dr. Cooper. We kind of run out of time, but I wanted to thank you for being on the Onyx Report. And just real briefly, can you tell people where they can find your book?
Yes, From Exploitation Back to Empowerment. You can find it on Amazon.com, as well as Peter Lang, publisher, PeterLang. My information is at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, UMass Boston. My email is Joseph, JOSEPH.Cooper@umb.edu. But yes, you can find the book on Amazon, and the second book, A Legacy of African American Resistance and Activism Through Sport, will be available on Amazon and Peter Lang as well.
All right. Well, thank you for being on the Onyx Report, brother. I really appreciate it. I am here to tell you, brothers, we are not criminals by birth, perennial rapists, incapable intellects, man-children, sperm donors, child support wellsprings, success objects, walking phalluses, ATM machines, lottery tickets, unpaid bodyguards, interchangeable stepfathers, child discipline proxies, unpaid repairmen, workhorses, or any other socially accepted dehumanizing stereotype. We are thinkers, inventors, innovators, leaders, fathers, and men. Embrace your humanity, know your worth, and extend your time, attention, and resources only to those who genuinely respect you. And remember, your worth is not defined by meeting other people's narcissistic, selfish, and unrealistic needs. You define your worth. Peace.